So thanks everyone for joining us today for our webinar. In the spirit of reconciliation, we acknowledge the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea and community. We pay our respects to the elders past and present and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders. My name's Nell Thompson. I'm the Secretary of the Australian Institute of Animal Management and I'll be hosting the webinar for you today. I've been on the AIM committee since 2013 and I'm also the coordinator of the National Getting to Zero program. The Australian Institute of Animal Management, or as we call it, AIM, is the national peak body representing local government animal management officers. And the AIM committee consists of a wide range of professionals engaged in various aspects of animal management. AIM seeks to support those engaged in the business of animal management and the function itself by providing training and information, opportunities for networking and collaboration, and by encouraging the use of best practice policies and practices. AIM understands the significant pressures placed on local government and not-for-profit rescue and rehoming service providers when working in the companion animal management space. We welcome new members and people can join via our website at www.aim.org.au. So to the agenda for today. Once I hand over to our presenter, there'll be around 50 minutes of presentation time and then around 10 minutes of question time once the presentation is concluded. The recording of the webinar will be accessible via our website to all members to watch at any time in a day or two once we get the recording up on the website, on the webpage. And we're going to ask that everyone mutes themselves during the presentation unless our presenter indicates otherwise. If you have questions, you can start putting them in the Q&A and chat section and we'll get through as many as we can at the end of the session. If you have very quick questions that relate to your understanding of the content, put your hand up and we'll try to get to them during the presentation. If you have more questions or we don't get to yours during the question time, you can send a message to our Facebook page and we'll get to it that way. As always, please excuse any working from home background noises that may filter through. We are very grateful to have Lesley Humphries here with us today from Pause for Play to talk about planning for fenced off-leash areas, also known as dog parks. Lesley is a strategic planner and policy writer who specialises in animal management, open space and recreation service planning. Lesley now works primarily with councils. And doing this, she works with councils writing domestic animal management plans, including conducting workshops, forums and surveys, drafting dog off-leash policies, reviewing off-leash local laws, assessing and reviewing off-leash areas, designing fenced off-leash areas, dog parks, and drafting management plans for fenced off-leash areas. So over to you, Lesley. You just unmute yourself, Lesley.
Here we go. Beaut. Okay, that working?
Perfect.
Beautiful. Okay, apologies, folks. Okay, look, I just thought right up front, I'll set a bit of a context in terms of today's presentation. While we're focusing on the design of off-leash areas and in particular fenced off-leash areas, there's a context that's really worth us understanding and noting. That in terms of the planning for and the design of these spaces, it's really important that we understand dog behaviour and of course human behaviour, and the interaction of both of those in off-leash areas of course is really quite critical. The benefits and challenges of off-leash and in particular fenced off-leash areas, we'll briefly go over those as well. I'll talk a little bit about the planning and policy context and why that's really important to have in place, and particularly in terms of any reference that your domestic animal management plan might make to this topic and this space. Many DAMPs don't make reference to dog off-leash issues or opportunities, and instead that tends to occur more in open space strategies or open space plans and rec plans. And it's really important that we make sure there's the cross-referencing between DAMPs and those other council strategic plans. The other thing that's really important in terms of all off-leash areas, particularly fence ones, is around site selection and evaluation. And going through a really good process for that means that if there's any criticism coming back from community about the sites that you've chosen, you've got a really sound rationale that you've based any decision making on. Then, of course, the focus of today's presentation around the design, but also the other that has to be considered, the rules and regs that are going to be associated with any fenced off-leash area, and they should be different to your unfenced areas. And the other matter that really needs to be considered, and so often is ill-considered when it comes to the ongoing management provision of any open space, whether it be off-leash areas or playgrounds or parks, and that's around the management and maintenance. And the real issue, I would imagine, for the majority of people that are attending this seminar, that quite often in the planning process and the design process, there is not the consideration given to how a space is going to be monitored or managed for compliance or managed for just good behaviour, both by dogs and dog owners. And this is where people in animal management need to make sure that they get in on the ground floor of any planning for off-leash areas, but in particular fenced, because there are real implications for animal management services. So I'm happy to take questions as we go on, excuse me, on any of these points, just understanding that the focus today is on design. Now, this next slide, look, I've put up really, it's about reinforcing what I've just said about the process or the planning process. And what I'm finding more and more in working with councils is that often the people who need to be involved throughout the process of planning and then design of these spaces are not included where they should be. I've had a case just recently where I've been asked to step in and help a council that has gone pretty much to a design phase without looking at the intervening steps that really you should go through before you get to the point where you say, this is where our fenced off leash area is going to be, and this is what they'll look like. And there are a number of things that we need to take into account. So instead of going through these steps where there's perhaps a demand or there's an inquiry, or it might come from a councillor or councillors who are really excited about what's happening elsewhere, or indeed might be what might be happening with another fenced off leash area you've got, and there's a real excitement around it. So there's often a push to go straight into providing something on the ground. In other words, it can go from this point here right to this point here without considering these intervening steps. So what I would say to you is that make sure that all the relevant internal stakeholders within council are involved. And I've just got an overview of those really that should be considered throughout the process. And even if there are internal stakeholders that you might say, well, they'll be the policy writers, they'll be the ones that bring all this information together. If they don't understand the environment and the context that you are working in and that these fenced off leash areas will operate in, then there's going to be some really crucial policy decisions made that won't be very well informed. So at this stage here, this is very much the outset, it's about who's got the knowledge, who has the understanding around dog behaviour and how dogs are going to behave in different types of environments, and indeed how they'll behave around each other and strange dogs, let alone how they're going to behave in a confined area that is a fenced off leash area. So it's where do we get this information from? And quite often I find that the information around dog behaviour can be quite absent in some organisations. Then there's, of course, understanding human behaviour in these environments, and this particularly relates to people who believe that their dogs are going to behave in a consistent way, the way they're used to them behaving and generally out in public, and therefore they translate that their dog's going to be fine in an overcrowded, fenced off leash area. So there's not the understanding necessarily with dog owners, and there's certainly, in terms of dog owners, there's that excitement and that passion about being with other dog owners and seeing their dogs have fun in these environments. So that quite often can override sensible decision making in terms of their monitoring their dog and reacting appropriately when their dog's acting a little out of the ordinary. So then it's also how do we address those risks? Who are the people that we need in this discussion to help us understand how we can address the potential risks that might be involved, but also optimising the outcomes. So, in here we need to understand what's the acceptable level of risk councils are going to accept for these spaces. And that's not to say we have to be super cautious right up the fearful end of the spectrum. It is merely acknowledging in the policy, as we do with play spaces, for example, that there's an element of risk that we're prepared to accept because the benefits outweigh the risk. So it's acknowledging those and having that clearly articulated. It's about the spatial requirements. What's the area that we need, particularly for a fenced off leash area? What's the space that we need in order to, as best as we can, manage potential risk? What are the compliance implications? What are the demands on animal management are there going to be? What are the expectations on that service in terms of working with community, educating community and monitoring these sites, because community does have higher expectations around off-leash areas, and I don't have to tell you that. But also then there's the maintenance around these spaces. What's going to be the requirement for an area that's going to be really intensively used, and therefore there's the degradation that goes with that. So then we move on to, right, okay, understanding all the information that we need. What are we going to determine that we will do? Where's that going to be? How are we going to do it? How are we going to go about it? And particularly saying that what council is not going to do, and not being afraid to state that up front. But it all has to be based on the combined knowledge and experience of these of the key stakeholders within the organisation. Then there's the next step in saying, okay, now we know what our policy is going to be, we know where we're going to do this and what our selection criteria might be for sites. So what does that mean on the ground? And so we're obviously going to have areas where we don't allow dogs. We don't think it's appropriate that they be there. They might be sensitive environments. We'll have on-leash only areas. And then we get into the context of what we're talking about today, that we'll have unfenced off-leash areas, we'll have partially fenced, and then we'll have fully fenced off-leash areas. And there's lots of discussion going on within councils around this area here about partially fenced off-leash areas. And for a number of very good reasons, and a significant one being about owners taking responsibility for actively monitoring their dogs, which doesn't tend to happen to the same degree in fully fenced off-leash areas. So there's lots of conversation happening in this space in local government at this time. Then once all that's determined, that's when we should be getting into the design of the spaces. So if councils are jumping from a position here of demand straight to let's have one and let's design it, what I am finding is a lot of the design is being driven in the landscape architect and in the open space planning area. And this is a concern because generally I'm finding landscape architects don't understand about dog behaviour, human behaviour in terms of dogs and how that plays out. And they want to overlay a design with their normal landscape rationale. Whereas design should be very much about how we manage the environment. Okay, so let's get into it. So the focus when we're designing, and the focus is very much on fenced off-leash areas here. But as I say to councils, if you provide really richly landscaped and vegetated areas in unfenced areas, then, or unfenced parks, then you can create some really exciting, challenging, environmentally rich areas for dogs without necessarily fencing the site. So our focus has to be around managing dog behaviour, which means we need to understand, just harping back, we need to understand what dog behaviour is likely to be in these environments. It's about minimising risk. It's about good amenity. So what I mean by that it's a nice place to go. It's not a place that's got barren earth because it's just been hammered to death. It has really robust features in there because we know dogs can give environments a hard time. And it's about minimising the long-term or ongoing maintenance requirements. And this, again, I'll reiterate, is an area where we tend to not plan for the maintenance requirements that we need over time. So ongoing maintenance, it's that regular maintenance, and then it will be the renewal maintenance that councils plan for in terms of their assets. So the key, how do we go about these? It's about creating elements or spaces or areas within your fenced off leash area, and I'll reference them as a FOLA, fenced off leash area. And the reason I really encourage you to talk about fenced off leash areas as opposed to dog parks, I know it's wordy, but off-leash areas are public open space areas, and because of that, it means that it should be reasonably safe within the understanding of what the space is used for any community member to go into. There are a number of dog owners out there who believe that a fenced off leash area, particularly when we call it a dog park, is for dog owners and dogs only. And anybody else in that space is there and needs to take the consequences if they're not favourable. Now, that's not what public open space is, and off-leash areas are situated in public open space. So it just helps us with the community education and community understanding and expectations that we have of them in these spaces. And that is that all relevant local laws apply. And in addition, there may be and should be some additional regulations that should apply to fenced off leash areas, primarily because they are confined spaces. So lots of different activity spaces, visual and physical barriers throughout the site. We know that if we can help minimise through our landscape treatments, we help minimise dog-to-dog eye contact, then that's going to disperse any intensive or help disperse any intensive dog activity that might occur. The other is lots of sensory and curiosity and physical elements in the site, again, to disperse dog activity and to detract, if you like, dogs from significant dog-on-dog activities. Confidence development elements can be included depending, of course, on the budget that you've got. Clatter bridges or climbable log branch elements. We know that the more confident dog will be a more sociable dog and is less likely to be overly perturbed by any new or strange events that it might come across in a public space. So if we can introduce those elements in these environments and they become second nature to our dogs, then they're far more comfortable and confident and less likely to antisocial behaviour. The other inclusion can be educational equipment. I prefer not to call it agility equipment. Again, it's just letting people know that this is not about equipment that might be associated with agility clubs and speed and height. This is about equipment that can be used as a focus for obedience training and confidence development with their dogs. It should be a low priority, particularly if there's not the space within the fenced off leash areas. And also equipment can be in unfenced off leash areas, particularly if it's designed so it can be used with dogs on leash. It's really important that there is signage associated with any equipment so that you're getting the most, or your dog owners are getting the most out of your investment in equipment. The other, and I can't stress this enough, is around the dollars that reasonably have to be allocated to fenced off leash areas. Again, because of a lack of understanding about how these spaces will be used and the intensity of the use, that there are many councils that might put 70,000, 50,000 aside for a fenced off leash area, not realising that the bulk of that's likely to be swallowed up in fencing. So most of the fenced off leash areas that we've been involved with over recent years, I'd be, recommending, upwards of 200, 250,000, depending on the size of your off-leash area, but you'll be surprised at the cost of undersurfacing and appropriate surfacing, particularly if you invest upfront in really robust surfaces. If you don't do that, you leave in grassed surfaces, you've got a small area, that is going to turn into a dust bowl or mud heap very quickly, and then you'll have the negative community backlash. So educating your council right up front that this is not a cheap upfront investment. It's probably an investment, though, that won't require the same renewal as most other significant infrastructure items. In terms of the design elements that you really need to consider for a fenced off leash area, this is an overview of them. The extent to which all of these or some of these will be included will depend on budget, but there are some pretty core elements that you'll need to have. Of course, if it's fenced, you've got your fencing, and then it's about determining the number of enclosures that you might have. Again, space is a consideration when it comes to determining how many spaces or enclosures that you'll have, because if you determine that you're going to have a quiet dog area as well as a main activity area, then it may mean that you're actually taking too much of the larger main activity area to incorporate that. That's, of course, if you don't have the adequate space. So you've got to weigh up where your pros and cons, what the advantages and disadvantages are going to be. On that note, if you do have the luxury of having space for two areas, two fenced enclosures, then I recommend that you call them the secondary or smaller area a quiet dog area, as opposed to small dog area. We know that there are some larger breeds of dogs that are very timid, quiet, and we don't want to dedicate a space that might be underused, particularly if you've got significant demand and you haven't got a larger main space. Entries and exits too are an absolute requirement. This means that if there's something going on in the off-leash area or up near one entry exit, that there's an opportunity for people to make a swift exit out of the secondary. And of course, you need maintenance access. Really important around signage, your requirements, your rules and regs. There's some interesting research around signage as to where people are more likely to read it, whether it should be inside the fenced off leash area as well as at your gate. But more can be said about that later. So that's just really picking up on how and where people are likely to read instruction. Amenities, seating and tables. Definitely don't put picnic tables inside an off-leash area or fenced off-leash area. We don't want to be encouraging picnics and food in these spaces. Dogs can get excited around food and take it out on each other and people, so we just don't want that conflict. Water clearly is a requirement. Now, shade structures, the preference would be to have natural shade in terms of trees. If you don't have that luxury up front, a shade structure may well be included. Considerations around car parking and toilet access. I'll talk a little bit more to that in terms of at what level of provision you might have some of these and where you mightn't. Then you've got your activity areas. I won't go into too much detail on that. We've covered a number of those, and I'll give you some examples of those further in the presentation. Landscaping, really important in terms of your shade, your vegetation along your fence lines. Again, that's about breaking sight lines when dogs are entering the fenced area. Space breakers throughout, and drainage. This can be another hidden expense on some sites. You're going to need drainage, particularly if there's low-lying areas, and that's going to consume a fair budget in terms of levelling of sites, putting in drainage and so forth. Irrigation may be a consideration. There are some pros and cons with that. And again, depending on the size. So that again is another additional significant cost. Really recommend that you put in robust undersurfacing. I've got examples where councils haven't had the budget, they've left primarily grass. It's been hammered within no time, and then they've had to go in and put a rock coverage in there to prevent the mud and sinking of the surface, actually in one case, and then granitic sand. So it wasn't much of a saving at all. And then other considerations that are really important is around universal design. And what we mean by that is designing so that you can optimise use of the space by all elements in the community, all demographics, all ages, all disabilities. So we want people who, older people who may be using walkers for them to be able to walk around the site or get into key elements in the site. People that are less mobile. So it's looking at your universal design, particularly when it comes to seating. Lots of these spaces have bench seats. I would encourage you to have seats with backrests and armrests. So again, we're making it more appealing to a wider demographic. Lighting, look, I'll just touch on lighting. Lighting generally depends on a council policy and where they might include lighting or not. There are some pros and cons. Most FOLAs that we've worked on have not included lighting, but that's about managing the use. Another consideration may be partnerships around dog clubs, and whether the area that you use or the parkland you use has an opportunity to bring together a number of different dog-related organisations. Now, that doesn't mean to say that a dog club would have any a priority use of a fenced off leash area. That's not what we'd be encouraging, but you may be able to locate a fenced off leash area at a reserve where there is a dog club operating. So you've got some really good integration and networking that's going on. Okay, this is just an example of what when you're involved in the planning, and I really encourage you to make sure that if there's any talk of fenced off leash areas, that you're involved in this, and just make sure that the knowledge you have around compliance and managing behaviour and monitoring is taken on board, because you want to make sure that any site that is chosen is easy to monitor by a drive-by, that you don't have to get out of the car, going deep into bushland to get to the fenced off leash area to be able to monitor it. You want, where possible, to be able to monitor by drive-by, as well as, of course, stepping into the off-leash area. So most councils, when they do their open space planning, they'll talk about service levels and different levels of provision at different sites. Now, most off-leash areas will be just that. They'll just be grassland and not much more. So most councils would say that would be a level 1 facility. A level 2 facility, there might be some elements for dogs. There might be some landscape environments. There might be some education equipment. The higher level provision will be your fenced off leash area. And that, just by nature of what it is, will cost more and have more elements within it. So councils, what I found, that councils that don't have a policy and a really clear direction around what they will provide and won't provide, end up having to deal with requests for fenced off leash areas on an ad hoc basis. And that was the case with open space and recreation planning about 15, 20 years ago, particularly in relation to playgrounds and other such amenities. What we need to make sure of here is that your fenced off leash areas, and indeed off leash areas, totally have a strategic plan, and there's a strategic approach, and that means everyone in the organisation is talking the same language, same direction, and there's no conflict. Okay, so let's have a look at some specific issues around design. One of the despite information out there to the contrary, one of the issues I find still occurring is that entries and exits to these spaces are in either corners or what we call in pinch points in these designs. Now, what we need to try and do with any entries or exits, as soon as a dog owner and dog steps inside a fenced off leash area, that they've got a 180-degree run or expanse to move away from the congestion of the entry with no obstacles that are going to be a hindrance. Now, by placing entries near or in corners, of course, means we're shutting down that open area, or the escape route, if you like, to a 90-degree, and we just want to minimise that. Not only that, it means that dogs and dog owners could get backed up into a corner, and we know the excitement that gets created at the entry to these facilities when new dogs arriving will attract a number of other dogs in the site, and there's a lot of excitement and can be a lot of confusion around around the entry. So right away from corners and away from any other obstacles. The other thing that is quite common, again, because there's a lack of budget, and you can see it in this slide here, the lady walking over with her 2 dogs. It's bare earth, similar with the one on the left-hand side and the one under that, which means they become badly eroded. In wet weather, they just become boggy and really messy and then unsightly. So making sure that you've got a really robust entry. The second down here on the right, it's got a really solid concrete pad and footpath. One thing I would draw your attention to here, you can see the wear and tear that's already occurring because people are shortcutting across to the entry, which of course makes sense because the dogs are going to head for that rather than head along the concrete footpath. So then it's about how we design this space and where we bring the landscaping so that we can create a robust surface here as well. An apron entry or even rockscaping out here that just funnels people along a more robust entry. Top left, the open slats here, small dogs can escape through and under these really easily. So not terribly effective in terms of what we're trying to achieve by double gated entry. And of course, that's to try and minimise escapees through the gate. So just, and this is, there's nothing wrong with farm style fencing. In fact, there are some environments where this is really most appropriate and fits in with the amenity of the environment. More formal fencing, such as the one at Eastfield Park here, that was in a more formal park environment along a fairly busy streetscape. So they determined that they'd go with the black cyclone wire fencing. Just another word in terms of offsets. This is a street footpath, as you can see here, that it's really wise to have a good offset from a footpath. It just means that anyone walking along the footpath doesn't have too much of a fright when a dog chases up to the fence and starts barking. So we're trying to create a nice amenity for everybody using the environment here. So just offsetting it from the footpath, this is probably quite a generous one. The other, if you didn't want to make it quite as wide as this, you can narrow it and put in some medium height vegetation, just again to screen eye contact. Bottom left is a bit of an overkill, and as you can, in terms of the concreting, also the double gated entry is overkill. It's just not necessary, and you can run into the problem of there being too many dogs and people in this area here, and just from an aesthetic point of view, it's not terribly attractive. In terms of corners, and this is another thing, despite the information being out there, that we need to try and eliminate corners, or at least make them very open corners. This is a case of a very open corner, remove the right angled corner. And in most cases, it's very easy to create rounded fence lines, which is what I'd encourage you to do. It just minimises opportunity for entrapment. Now, there's many a conversation that is had around fence heights, and fences are not to keep dogs that jump in. They're meant as a barrier for the dog who is reasonably and as we would expect under control of their owner, and fences are there for a barrier. So they're not for these sorts of dogs who are happy to leap over the fence, and for their owner to be happy for them to do that. So in terms of fences, We've actually got a paper that we provided for a council that needed information or rationale for 1.2 metre fencing rather than I think it was 2 metre fencing that was recommended in a publication in that particular state. The rationale for not having high fencing is about the messages that we send to dog owners, about the expectations, about the control that they will have over their dog. If a dog is to jump a 1.2 metre fence, it should not be off leash in a public place because it is not under effective control. So I can provide some more information or rationale around that. The other with high fencing, and while not as significant an issue, it is in terms of how we plan our open spaces, is that high fencing is not aesthetically very appealing, and it certainly does not add to the amenity of our public open space. Okay, in terms of the sort of, excuse me, elements that you would include in, and this can be in an unfenced off-leash area too. So if your council is going down the line of unfenced off-leash areas, it doesn't mean that they have to remain just open grassland areas. You can encourage landscape features that improve the amenity of the site, provide a nice environment for everybody to be in, but also provide some stimulating environments for dogs, and they can be used as physical barriers as opposed to fences, so they can help distract dogs from moving outside of a wider area. Most of these, except one, are in fenced areas. The dry creek bed. One of the issues you need to be very careful of with incorporating this sort of amenity is that the rocks are very rounded, and that you don't have in close proximity large numbers of rocks such as these two here, with an uneven surface. We recently were involved with a dog park that had been developed, designed, and indeed constructed, and they had complaints from their community when they sent through a photograph that the complaints were based on. They'd had large of these rocks very close to each other with other the smaller rocks in between, which meant that the dogs didn't have the space to step down off the larger rocks onto a different surface and the space to get their balance before they were being confronted very close by another large rock. So it's really critical that you understand how to set up these environments. Whoops, sorry, back to that. Again, creek bed, scattered large rocks, which in themselves become sensory environments after a time, once more dogs have had a bit of a play around them. This one in the centre here, this is pea pebble. Going back to saying that we're trying to introduce different textural surfaces for dogs so that they become quite happy with coming across different elements in community, take it in their stride, more confident. So again, it just shows you how you can introduce, those elements within a contained environment. I'll just say here with the grasses, be very careful about the environment in which your fenced off leash area is in. If you're near creeks, creek beds, waterways, and you're in hot environments, you need to make sure that your landscape features minimise the opportunity for snakes and so forth. Climbable elements, bottom right's a more formal structure. We tend away from that now because it's not it's not as really inviting or challenging for dogs, but what you can do with these is create logs and branches that are climbable on top and intersperse plantings in between the rocks. And that very easily and very quickly changes the interest that dogs will have on the environment. Okay, all right, I'm going to speed up just a little bit because of time. Again, look, just showing you what you can do with environments. The second from the right there on the bottom, we refer to space breakers, breaking sight lines. That's probably a really good example of one that you can have. Different treed environments, very simple in terms of the environments, mulching underneath, lovely amenity to a park, and the mulch and the granitic sand provide, again, different textural surfaces. Now, what we're trying to avoid, and this is typical of not understanding what money's needed for these sites, and just really not understanding what they should be on about. We are way past the point where we're providing a fenced area, and that's all we do. And we say that that's all dog owners should expect. They've got that in a parkland. That's where we stop. We don't want our parklands to look like that, and dog owners will not go to these places. Just because they've got a dog doesn't mean they're going to enjoy going to these places. So really important that we make them attractive places. In some sites that we've come across have had these elements. I'm not too sure about party slides, but you know, they're still out there, not to the same extent, I hope. Second on the left, look, it's obviously an attempt to provide a low-cost tunnel. There are two issues here. One is that's really hard to maintain and keep good grass coverage, as you can see. And if a dog gets into trouble in that tunnel, yeah, maybe a small person could crawl in, but we don't want to have to do that. And there may well be broken glass that's put in there. It's just not a good feature to include from a risk management point of view. Top left, you can see where dog owners have tried to patch holes where dogs have tried to dig underneath. Really important then about, even if you're putting cheaper fencing in, that you bury it into the ground, or invest in higher end fencing and have the lower crossbar that prevents that. Centre, whoops, let me get back to that. Centre to bottom here, where the water, they had significant rain events. This was put in cheaply, again, low budget, not much money. There were no, there was not a lot of work done in terms of drainage and so forth on that site, and that's what you'll end up with. So really important to invest ahead. My reference to high fencing, that picture says it all. My reference to the need for drainage and for levelling of land, this is another area we'll get complaints where there's puddles and muddy dogs at the end of the day out. Just a very quick point here. This was when, top left, when this park was first established, new vegetation going in and so forth. Lovely open site. We can see through to the different sections of the park, which is a really important safety issue. Because the wrong species of trees was put in, or lack of maintenance in terms of stripping the lower trunks of trees, we end up with the situation on the right. So it's the same site, but now we actually can't see through to the area behind those trees, which from a safe amenity point of view is not a good thing. Similarly, on the left here, lower left, when the area, the fenced off-leash area was first open, 5 years later, we now don't have good clear sight lines into the park, which again is a safety issue. when you're designing these, there will always be the request for grass, and you are going to have to make the call as to whether you you acknowledge what's going to happen, or excuse me, acknowledge what's going to happen in the pretty immediate term, particularly if you've only got a small area of grass, and you make the call right up front that you're going to put a robust surface in. Most fenced off leash areas, because of the size, because we don't have the luxury of space, we end up having to really put robust surfaces in, and then breaking that up with some softening landscape features that are attractive to dogs but soften the landscape. So on the left, when this particular area was new, in fact, it hadn't been open very long, and already you can see the degradation. And that also is because the dog owners like standing on the grass, and there was the wear and tear from dog owners as well as dogs. Only about a year later, they decided to replace the grass, and this again is where it's really important for a whole of council approach, that the responsibility for maintaining the space now was with open space maintenance, with parks maintenance. So they just went in and replaced what was there. But there should have been the step back from this and saying, right, okay, we know what's going to keep happening on an annual basis. Do we keep laying new turf, or do we now put a rockscape or a different environment in here with mulch underlaying and perhaps trees and rockscapes? So we actually create another sensory environment rather than something that's just going to wear and it doesn't achieve very much. Down the bottom, similar, opening on the left, 6 weeks later, this was the situation. And again, because of budget limitations. Okay. Nell, have we got any questions so far on any of that info?
We do. There are a few questions that can wait till the end if you'd prefer. There's some great questions coming in though.
Okay. All right. If they don't relate specifically to that info, then we might do it at the end, and I'll just finish off with some of these slides.
Yeah, great.
Okay. All right. This is just an example. It was Craigieburn. It's the size 2006. They had a budget of about 185,000. At the time, that got them quite a good area. It was all granitic sand, apart from some mulch areas. It was on an old landfill site, so it was very difficult to establish grass anyway. But the intensity of use, they're all saying, thank goodness we went the granitic sand. The fence for the quiet dog area went in later, again because of budget. Okay, this was a slightly larger one. This was built in Moama. It was about 1.4 hectares, so a really good size. They had access to water, a dam on site. So they decided that they would put in grassed area, but there's also enough grassed area to be able to isolate some, fence it off so it could regenerate, and if need be, could fence off the whole of the grass area to let it regenerate. So that's when you can make a decision about having grass if you've got that luxury of space. The budget on this, when it was costed, was about 350,000. They built it in-house for 250. A really good project, great example. Swan Hill, this is in concept stage. They've got a master plan approach to this. They've only got 70,000, 80,000, which they know that's only going to get them the fence and maybe some pathways, but they're entering into a community fundraising stage. Their community is really excited and they're going to fundraise for elements in here. So rather than council say, right, we're not going to put all these elements in because we don't want to raise community expectations, council agreed to put them in, and now they're working in partnership with community. That's an excellent outcome. I just throw this one in terms of the size of some of the spaces that we've worked on. Ferguson's paddock, the second one there, this is actually a picture of Ferguson's paddock. The community here just wanted a paddock. They didn't want anything else in there apart from some vegetation and plantings. So that's fairly large. Martin Place is a well-used area, and again, significant element of really robust granitic sand surfacing broken up by landscaping. They're doing that over time. But that gives you a bit of a picture of some of the sites. Okay, I'm just going to, I've got some other slides here in terms of responsible use that I can come back to, but I'm thinking now that maybe if we do the questions and then if there's some time, I can come back to some of these. How does that sound?
Yeah, great idea. Okay, so Sandra has asked some fantastic questions. Her first one is, do you have data on the frequency, number or increased risk of dog attacks in dog parks? We have 2 dog parks and to date have only had 1 minor attack that occurred in the park.
Yeah, no, it's really hard at the moment to collect that information. Most councils tend to only record, dog attacks or bites as open space or near the home or in the home. So there's not any data that I've been able to find that that suggests that there's an increase or the same level of attack or bite. However, from survey work that we've done, we are picking up that residents or people who use these are reporting higher incidents of dog-on-dog incident and dog rushes. So yeah, and dog bites. So they're reporting a higher incidence of that. We know from reports from hospitals that they're saying that they believe that the incidence of dog bites is probably underreported to the extent of about 80%, which is really concerning. Similar to other facilities like playgrounds and skate parks, we know that people are less likely to report relatively minor incidents, even if they're nips or rushes, because they, number one, people assume that they're in a dog off-leash area and that anything goes. And the other is that they're fearful that the facility might be taken away or there might not be other facilities developed. So it's really hard at the moment. From local laws officers, I do get feedback that there's a higher incidence of rushes and attacks, even if they're mild, in off-leash areas, and they're saying that the incidence in fenced off-leash areas can be more significant, but it varies from council to council.
Okay, so the next question was, do you have good examples of good dog parks? Now, I'm not sure whether that was covered in those slides with those great images from before and the listing, or did you have others that you would say, look, these are really great, go and have a look at them?
Yes. Now, keep in mind that some of the designs, because of lack of budget, as in the one I showed you, let's see if I can flip back to it. No, look, I won't do that. If the budget is not there to put in all the elements that you should put in, while the design might have those elements in, councils might be doing them over time. But I'd certainly suggest the Moama one is a great example and really good, talking to Luke about how they went about that in-house. He's a very creative operator and has a really good team. It's one of the, I guess, the differences between rural or regional councils is they can do it that way a little more than metros can. But most of them, and I've got some case studies if people now are interested, that look at the design, look at what's happened over time, and look at what should be done or could be done differently. So I'm happy to provide that.
Fantastic. Well, let's make sure that we put your contact details up before we go, and people can email you for those.
Sure.
Neil's got a great question. We're starting to include airlock entries into play spaces to control entry of multiple persons. Is this also being seen in FOLAs for people to control multiple dogs entering at the same time? Now, I know, Lesley, you said a moment ago that you're not a fan of airlocks, but I just wanted to add, from a behaviour perspective, I love airlocks because you can get an idea of how the dog that you're taking in, you can give it a minute to acclimate, if you like, in the airlock, let the other dogs come up and greet through the fence, and you can get a little bit of an idea of whether it's going to be a good mix with the group that's already actively playing. So what's your take on that, Lesley?
You might have misunderstood me. Absolutely, double gated entries are a must.
Ah,
Absolutely.
perfect. Okay, I did misunderstand. Apologies.
Yeah, no. What I was referring to with the double gated entries is where they're located. There's a lot of maybe that's where the confusion came in, because what I'm seeing where these are designed in-house is that gating is often near a corner or near an obstacle. So it's about keeping it away. So with the double gated entry, it needs to be on the outside of the fenced area, so that there's minimal right angles on the inside. And I'm still seeing double gated entries with the double gating on the inside. They must be on the outside. So we're trying to minimise any entrapment. And you're dead right, Nell. We don't want them too large. It might have been back where the concrete one was. Maybe that's where I got you confused. That they don't have to be too large. We don't want a lot of people and dogs in there at the one time. But they are excellent. And I think this is what you're alluding to, Nell, in that if they've got actually a long edge along the fence line, when you've taken your dog into that double gated area, then there's some really great meet and greet stuff that goes on through the fence. And often that can then dispel the congestion once you step past that second gate into the dog park, because they've already done the meet and greet and there's less congestion. So they're a must in terms of managing escapees, and they're brilliant in terms of that initial introduction. But they don't have to be too big so that we haven't got a lot of dogs and a lot of people in there.
Perfect. That clarifies it. Thank you. Sandra's got another great question. The idea of rockscapes in unfenced off-leash areas is great, creates a great space for all the community to use. Interested in your thoughts about how you manage people/children and dogs playing in the area at the same time. Not all children are comfortable with dogs and vice versa.
No, and I'm going to throw this up. So one of the challenges is around the age of young people that should be in these areas. We say toddlers, and toddlers in pram should not be there. And in fact, really, children under 10. There are some parks in the US that don't allow children under 14 into these areas. Certainly toddlers and youngsters should not be. I mean, this situation here, and this lady with the pram, and it was this lady who said, I let my toddlers in here because they're used to being around dogs. And this gets back to what I was saying about a human behaviour and dog behaviour, that at home a dog might behave in a certain way. We can't predict how they're going to behave with screaming youngsters around, with other dogs around, with dogs that are a bit more assertive around us. We can't take that chance. So toddlers and children just shouldn't be in these spaces at all. And we have to we have to ask, at what age is a young person, or at what age do they have the maturity and wherewithal to be able to deal with an incident that might occur in one of these areas? So it's very hard for an adult to hold back when their dog is in a situation with another dog. It's an automatic response to try and rescue, pull them out. So if we as adults don't have the wherewithal to stop that immediate reaction, we can't expect young people to, and they just don't have the maturity to do that. So that's when you have to make some fairly significant decisions around the age that you require people to be before they can take a dog unsupervised or be unsupervised in a dog park. So, 14 to 16 is probably, the limit.
That's great. Thank you. Okay, Craig from Wodonga. Do other councils enforce the different dog areas, i.e. quiet area or small or larger dog areas, or are they self-regulated in your experience, Lesley?
Yeah, they're largely self-regulated. I haven't heard from any councils that they have problems with this. The one of the issues you can get is that, and this might happen in a quiet dog area as well as the main area, that you will invariably come across a situation where a poorly behaved dog is in the area and there's no one else there. And that's because people come to understand the times at which that dog owner and dog's there, and they just don't go. Or else you've got someone with a poorly behaved dog in the quiet area. And then it's really up to people who use the dog park to let councils know what's happening, and that then is when when animal management local laws have to step in. And this is again what I refer to in terms of the demand on animal management services. There needs to be a really proactive PR exercise, which doesn't tend to happen. And that's around use, that's around expected behaviour, that's around control of dogs. So there's a separate public relations media campaign that needs to go on in relation to these places.
Okay, and another question from Craig. Liability would be a concern by having the different textural areas. How is that generally managed, i.e. injuries to dogs and or people from slips, trips and falls?
That's very much about the design and how each of those elements interface with each other. I can't say that we've come across any reports or issues. In the dry creek bed, yeah, someone might step off a rock and slide. That's about incorporating flat topped rocks in those areas. It's also comes back to your policy that I spoke about earlier. Why have you got these elements in there? And as with play spaces, that if you can clearly articulate that the benefits outweigh the disadvantages, and you've got that clearly documented in your rationale, then as best as you can, you've got yourself covered. But it's also about interface, and it's a good point you raised, because from a maintenance point of view and an amenity point of view, it's about the interface between some of these surface areas, mulch and granitic sand, for example, and how you use rock edging or edgings to help maintain that. But it's as in any environment, be it a playground where you've got rockscapes and climbable elements and so forth, is you make that call around policy.
And Yvette asks, how well do people pick up after their dogs in FOLAs?
Probably a little bit better than in unfenced areas, because there's some self-monitoring that goes on. But if you've gone to a fenced off leash area, you'd be able to walk around with a plastic bag and pick up loads of dog droppings. The litter issue, and I do, where is it? Okay, so dog litter is likely to raise more ire than any other open space matter. And the problem with it, it's about changing behaviours. Behaviours are really hard to change, and it will be a perennial issue, this. And it was interesting that a survey we conducted of about 4,000 people when we were writing the one of the dam plans, indicated that 75% of respondents, so 75% of that 4,000, said that they don't always pick up their dog litter. So it gives you, and that correlates with some research that came out of the States a number of years ago that indicated that between 10 and 15% of people are likely to always pick up their dog litter. So this little piece of research that was undertaken by Whitehorse Council some years ago, that it's all about visibility. You'll get better compliance if you're at a high profile site, if there's more people using the site, that if the area is, unkempt or poorly managed, you're going to likely get a lower level of compliance. Really interesting that people will pick up the dog litter if they think they're being watched. And again, in the research, people clearly told us that if someone was with them, they'd be more likely to pick it up. And along trails, you'll find bag litter on the side of trails where people have obviously picked the litter up, and then once they're into a more discreet area, they've tossed the litter bags on the side of the trails. It's a perennial issue. When someone finds the solution to it, I think it'll turn the industry around. But it's a problem.
Got a couple of questions to add, Lesley. One of the parks that I saw in the States that was actually attached to an animal shelter involved a membership sort of management style, whereby people went to an education session or had some interaction with the managing body for the park, and then were provided with a key or a electronic tag or something like that, so that not only could the managing body track who was in the park when they arrived, when they left, so if there was a complaint at any time, but they knew that people had received a base level of information, knew how to manage themselves, and they actually paid a fee because it was privately run by the shelter. They actually paid an annual fee, and it was a really popular park with lots and lots of members. Has that been looked at here in Australia, that sort of model, or could that work for local government?
Yeah, no, it hasn't been looked at here, and it would certainly be worth looking at. One of the we have a different philosophy than in the States in terms of access to facilities. There's a lot more private facilities over in the States in relation to this sort of thing. There's some amazing dog parks that are acres large, that are private, they're fenced, and people pay. There is a culture in Australia where anything to do with public open space, in particular, should be freely accessible. So there's a slightly different culture. That's not to say it shouldn't be something that could be or should be discussed. I think it has merit, but it also has some challenges. How do we monitor? Who takes responsibility for monitoring and the registrations and so on and so forth? So again, it would come back to resourcing via council, most likely. So it's certainly worth putting on the table. just know from my own experience with recreation facilities and open space facilities in the States and here that it's just a different approach, a different culture at the moment.
Okay, but something to look at potentially.
Yeah.
The other question I had was around the Swan Hill Park. You mentioned that there was community fundraising. How did that work?
Um, Look, it's probably again it comes back to a a different culture in rural communities to metro. And again, there's a difference here with US and Australia. With a lot of the dog parks in the US, there's a community involvement, and they have community planting days and community build days and all sorts of things. We don't tend to have that anywhere near the same extent here in Australia. In the environment field, we do. This The involvement by community came about here because we ran an online community forum in relation to the development of the concept plan. We talked about there only being 80,000 for the project, as I said, and that council was reluctant to incorporate anything more than what they could build for 80,000, which wouldn't have been much apart from fences and some grass. And so we put to the community that council can either come up with a concept plan that is very minimalist, or council can come up with a master plan, but then it would be up to community to get involved. Now, there were enough people in that community forum who said that they would put their hands up to help organise fundraising programs within the community, approach the Bendigo Bank, approach a number of businesses in the area, have fundraising days. So it was very much a rural city spirit, and I'm not sure where they're at with that, but they were ready to go, and council hadn't even adopted the concept at that stage.
Wow, fantastic. Okay. All right. I think that might be the end of our questions, and we're coming up for an hour 20. It's been an amazing discussion, a fantastic presentation. I've learnt heaps, and I'm sure everyone else has as well. Malcolm's just popped something in the chat. Greyhound Racing Victoria has slip tracks on public open space that runs a program allowing greyhound owners to purchase keys to assess the slip track. This could be extended to spaces for other dog breeds. See, that's another really interesting approach. I'm sure there are ideas that we can take from, whether it's other countries or other, sectors, types of users, things like that, for these spaces. But thank you so much, Lesley. It's been a really brilliant presentation. Really enjoyed it. Your details are there on the screen. I think, is your email address there?
No, actually my email address is not there. No.
Okay. If you want to pop that in the chat now, and then everyone has got that, and it'll be the chat will also be in the recording, so those who access the recording after this live event will have the contact details, and of course people can contact us if they need more information or want to get in contact with Lesley. But thank you very much, everybody. Stay tuned to our social media pages and the e-news for announcements about future webinars in this series, and feel free to send us through suggestions for topics or presenters that you'd like to see featured. So have a good afternoon and take care, everybody. Thanks again.
Cheers.